This is our climate breakout, climate policy breakout, and we are joined by Clara Summers here. Hi, Clara. Good to see you and have you here. She serves as the Climate and Energy Manager for NCEL, or the National Council on Environmental Legislators. Her portfolio includes the power sector writ large, so the renewable energy and efficiency sector, as well as transportation, land use, climate resilience, and a just transition. So Clara began her environmental career, she says, as a third grader, organizing classmates on the playground to sign a petition against oil drilling in the Arctic refuge. Yeah, I would have signed that. Having spent part of her childhood and adulthood in Indonesia, Clara has witnessed firsthand the cumulative and ongoing impacts of climate change. She's got a master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution and a graduate certificate in environment, peace, and conflict resolution from the American University School of International Service, and also a BA in anthropology and Czech language from the University of Washington. We are in very good hands here, I should say, with Clara's background and all of her experience. You sit in actually all of the different nexus that we heard about earlier this week. And so I will go ahead and let you take it away. We only have about 30 minutes here, so we'll get started. Thanks, Clara.
Thanks so much, Rikia, and the rest of the WIL team for having me here today. As she said, my name is Clara Summers. I'm the Climate and Energy Manager at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL. I know that many of you are actually already members, so it's exciting to interact with you in this way through WIL. But for those of you that don't know, NCEL is a nationwide network of more than 1,000 state legislators focused on shared learning and action. Our mission is to empower legislative champions to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. Created by and for state legislators, NCEL provides resources on environmental issues through legislative research, events, and facilitated collaboration between lawmakers working on similar issues. We are nonpartisan and non-lobby. NCEL serves as remote environmental staff to connect legislators between states and also with experts and resources on a wide range of environmental issues. But our three main issue areas, and sorry, you can go to the next slide. This is the overview of NCEL. Our three main issue areas are environmental health, conservation, and climate and energy, which I manage. You can go to the next slide again. Next slide, please. Well, it will happen, I'm sure. If you ever have a question related to environmental policy, you should not hesitate to reach out and ask. If we can go to the next slide. Great, and one more after that, please. Beautiful, thank you. So I am especially excited to be here with you all today because I really support the work that you do to reframe national security. As Rikia mentioned, my master's degree is in international peace and conflict resolution, and the focus was on the environment. And climate change is critical to peace building both abroad and at home. While climate change by itself does not cause conflict, it can be understood as a threat multiplier that exacerbates the vulnerabilities that do lead to conflict. So, for example, some scholars have made a connection between prolonged drought and the Syrian civil war. Here in the US context, I will be surprising no one when I say that we're living in a time of extreme polarization. The stress of climate change, whether that be extreme heat, hurricanes, wildfires, drought, flooding, puts additional pressure on already faltering governance systems. A warming world and increasing climate chaos can exacerbate existing factors that influence the propensity for conflict. But just as climate change can help to exacerbate climate factors, addressing climate change through policy is also an opportunity to address systemic racism, wealth inequality, health, and good governance. So there is good news here. My goal today is to give you a sense of how your climate policy work can not only address emissions, but help support peace building here in our own context. And I also want to avoid talking at you for too long. So my goal here, we'll see if I achieve it, is to keep the monologue to about 15 minutes and then invite you all to weigh in so we can have a conversation. So with that framing, I will jump into the top 3 things to think about as you do climate policy work. And you see this Venn diagram on your screen here, or you should at least. These 3, I would say, are equally important, and some of them happen at the same time. So the first step, if we can go to the next slide. So the first step in taking climate action is to know your stuff. One thing I can confidently say is that each and every one of you has a tool that you can use to promote climate policy action. Sometimes legislators think I'm not on the energy committee or on the PUC committee, and therefore I don't have any ability to make changes. That is not true. I want to encourage you and empower you. Climate change touches every aspect of our economy. So if you're on the bonding committee, you can ensure that climate risk is accounted for in the bonding process. If you're on the transportation committee, you can support the expansion of public transit. If you're on the Health and Human Services Committee, you can come up with a climate adaptation plan for extreme heat days and the health effects related to them. The options are myriad. And those are just a few examples. As I go through this presentation, think about what committees you're on and what ways the climate crisis touches the issues that you care about. Another aspect of knowing your stuff is knowing the relevant policies. An important thing to think about here is whether you're going to go expansive or whether you're going to go granular. Both are really important. If you're in a leadership role in your state, you might explore far-reaching policies like net zero emissions targets, carbon pricing, or a renewable portfolio standard. But if you don't think your state is politically ready to take far-reaching action, or alternatively, if your state has already done the expansive work and now the devil is in the details, you can also identify really granular policies that have impact and are really important for a transition to clean energy, but haven't been done yet. Next slide, please. So an example of a granular policy could include electrifying school buses or passing a community solar program. But to give you a sense of the scope of climate policy work available and happening, this slide, I know it's a lot of text. The idea is just to show you an overview of the range of climate action that states across the country took in just this past session. So you see really expansive policies like Rhode Island's SB 78, you heard from Senator Oyer this morning, which requires the state to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But there are also states like New Mexico that went more granular with HB 15 to create a sustainable building tax credit. Those are just examples of things that you can do. Next slide, please. So with all of that in mind, the other step of climate policy work is to incorporate peace building into your policy design. In the US context, we often think of this as environmental justice. So if you're confused about the terminology, the principles are largely the same. As I mentioned at the beginning, because of structures that we didn't create but still persist, policies often, unfortunately, don't help everyone equitably. In the United States, the most predictive factor for where toxic infrastructure is located is still race. If a particular community is especially vulnerable or overburdened by pollution, it's really important to target protections for them in your climate legislation. And I'll give examples of all of these things if we can go to the next slide. So here are some ways that you can incorporate principles of environmental justice into your climate policy. You can define what constitutes environmental justice, and this is different in each state. In some states, This will be communities that are heavily overburdened by pollution. They're right by fossil fuel infrastructure. In other states, this will be really rural areas that are maybe at the forefront of the extractive economy and don't have a lot of access to infrastructure. So it's really place specific. It's important for your state to think about how this might be defined in your own context. And a good way to do that is by engaging communities through stakeholder advisory committees. Washington State this year passed legislation called the HEAL Act, which creates a stakeholder process for advising the state on environmental justice issues and prioritizing vulnerable communities. It's also really important to make sure, since historically and currently not everyone has benefited equitably from our policies, that the benefits are really targeted to address inequity when you're doing a climate policy. In New York and across the country, states are making sure that the proceeds from certain climate programs, for example, a carbon pricing program, go more towards overburdened and underserved communities. Go to the next slide. Through your climate policy, it's really important to clean up air quality in areas with existing fossil fuel infrastructure by passing stronger state air regulations. And another way that you can prevent pollution hotspots is by passing a cumulative impact bill that prevents the state from issuing permits for new toxic infrastructure. Another thing, if we go to the next slide. So another thing that you can think about is how we build the new clean energy economy to include everyone. States like Illinois have passed a Clean Energy Jobs Act, which creates a workforce development program in the clean energy sector specifically targeted towards workers of color, women workers, formerly incarcerated workers, and other groups that have more difficulty getting representation in the workforce. In addition, it's really important to not forget that there are communities throughout our country who have powered us for so long in fossil fuel producing states that might be really economically dependent on those sources. So like coal communities, oil and gas communities, they will need some sort of support and replacement as we transition to clean energy. That's why states like Colorado have created an Office of Just Transition to do the deep listening and community support necessary in these communities where the coal economy is declining. If we go to the next slide, please. So it's a little bit trite. We've all heard this think globally, act locally phrase before, but the adage is true. What we do here in the US regarding climate policy has an international impact. As we grow the renewable energy economy, it's critical that we don't use the same template that was used for the extractive fossil fuel past. That means from the beginning, policymakers can be mindful of how batteries for electric vehicles and implements for solar panels and wind turbines can be designed for reuse. Otherwise, we will just have another frontier of mineral extraction. California is leading on this issue by creating a task force to determine how they can maximize reuse and recycling of batteries for EVs and storage. There are also proposed policies for deforestation-free procurement and Buy Clean standards. Buy Clean standards set a procurement preference for low emissions goods, which also has the positive impact of often keeping jobs within the United States because for all of our flaws, we do tend to have stronger environmental regulations than other countries. So this is an example of how the best climate choice is also the best jobs choice. If we go to the next slide. So this last thing I want to share is getting organized once you have your climate policy identified and designed. The astute observer will notice that identifying the relevant stakeholders and engaging with communities was on the peace building slide previously, and here it is again. That's because it's super important. I hope that throughout the whole process of determining policies, legislators can be talking with all of the folks who will be impacted or have a stake in the process, whether they be environmental justice communities, rural communities, labor, of course, your constituents, or anyone else who might be impacted or supportive during the process. Ideally, a legislator would also be talking with their fellow legislators to get support. And one way that we are increasingly seeing states better strategize and collaborate is by forming state-based climate caucuses. This is really helpful for getting people who are working on different committees and on a whole bunch of different issues all on the same page, so that you can make sure that there aren't duplicative efforts or competing bills, and that all of the work of you and your peers comes together to take comprehensive climate action. And NCEL has developed a resource to help with that. I am more than happy to share these resources after the discussion, should you be interested in it. So with that said, I kept to my goal almost of a 15-minute remarks, and I want to invite anyone to unmute themselves, get on video, and share any of your thoughts, your challenges. Yes, you can go to the Learn More slide with the group, because this, I don't need to talk at you. This can be a collaborative space where we're all working together and sharing ideas. I can also rephrase that. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I'm going to come join you here, Clara. That was a phenomenal presentation. I learned a lot, and thank you so much for sharing the resources, because we do want to get those up. We have this breakout for you all. I see a couple of legislators in the room, so we want to invite you on camera for. We want this to be interactive. Yeah, all you have to do is just turn off or unmute yourself on the mic in the bottom left-hand corner, and then also turn your camera on. You'll see the icon there too.
You're also welcome to put questions in the chat if that's easier. Did I talk over someone? Maybe
oh, here we go. Representative Waite from Utah.
Hello. Speak. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Oh, I don't think I can hear you now. If you can hear me, I'm driving, so I'm trying to listen. And thank you so much, but I won't be participating because I'm driving. I just didn't want to be invisible in the group.
We're really glad you're here.
Yeah, and thanks for taking us in while you're driving.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to join us on screen or have questions? I want to hear about any challenges maybe you've had in trying to either message for clean energy, or, if you're able to do a step further and pass policy, or at least try to introduce legislation.
See a question about advice to those in very red states with some legislators denying climate change. That is an excellent question, and it's a really tough one. I think going with the jobs angle has been quite popular. If all of your work around clean energy is framed as we want job creation in the solar industry, that can be really helpful from a messaging perspective. Another thing to think about is ratepayer impacts. Fossil energy is actually a lot more expensive. And while the fossil fuel industries would love us to believe that solar and wind are less reliable. They don't have a fuel cost, which means that they're not prone to the same sorts of economic disruptions of the fuel economy. And that cost of fuel doesn't have to be passed on to ratepayers. So you can go for strictly economic and jobs arguments, and that can certainly help. Another thing that we've seen work in some states is going after pollutants that have an easy alternative. For example, hydrofluorocarbons is something that regulating those is something that gets bipartisan support. And they're easy to regulate for other alternatives. Another thing I'll say is the focus on resilience. Like, you might not be able to talk about climate change, but you can talk about disaster resilience or extreme weather resilience. So in your state, what you might be focused on is actually adaptation to climate change, but you don't have to say that. So some states have set up offices of disaster resilience that do a lot of the climate adaptation work that you would see in another state as well. Finally, the one other thing I'll add is that agriculture is a place where there can also be emissions reductions that can benefit farmers. So supporting farmers who are already engaging in certain climate-friendly practices, whether that is cover cropping or agroforestry or no-till, or managed grazing, if the state can find ways to make grants available to those farmers to support them in the work that they're already doing, that is helpful to the carbon cycle. It allows our working lands to sequester carbon more effectively, and it helps our farmers. So those are some initial thoughts. I'm also happy to go through some other resources that I didn't touch on. If we go back, there's an earlier slide on the know your stuff slide. I think it's slide 5. There we go. So one thing I'll note is NCEL has a newly launched website. We have a lot of resources there. If you want to take a look at it, you can also search for legislation in different states. If you're interested in a particular topic, we have a legislative tracker bill map. And we also have fact sheets and issue pages on a whole bunch of different environmental issues. And now that's in the chat. Thank you, Rikia. Another thing I'll flag is our partners at Climate Cabinet worked with us to create the building blocks of state climate policy, which give a good introduction to what you can do in each sector of the economy to address climate change. And these are tried and true policies that different states have implemented across the board. That's a good starting point. And thank you, Ava, for putting that in the chat as well.
I don't want to speak if you were going to speak. I was going to mention Climate Cabinet. Cabinet is who we are hoping to do more work with. So in the same way, with our other breakout sessions, we are wanting to do follow-on workshops with you all as you come back into your sessions next year. We want to invite Climate Cabinet back. Unfortunately, they couldn't join us today, but we'll invite them back for an additional workshop in the future.
They're good folks. We've worked with them quite a bit. Well, I'm also aware that y'all have been on the screen for many hours today and this week and all of the time. So if there aren't other questions, I'm very happy to give you 5 minutes back. But please know how much of a privilege it is to be with you all today. And thank you for all of the work that you do Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have follow-up questions. We do provide individualized support for state legislators and are happy to put you in touch with legislators in other states as well who have worked on policies that you're exploring.